frankly, needed intelligence more than ever. There were certainly people on both sides who were worried that that actually the threat from the other side remained, so they needed to keep spying. But I also think there's a sense in which the West took their eye off the ball when it came to Russia. They basically, a lot of people in Washington, in London, and other places thought the Cold War is over.
Exactly. That just used to freak me out. I used to hear that, and are you people out of your minds? Where did you get this idea that automatically it's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya time? I'm sorry to interrupt, but that just used to jar the daylights out of me. I'm thinking, where's Winston Churchill when you need him? But please continue.
No, and I think that's absolutely right. In that there were people who saw this new world, and we didn't need to worry about Russia anymore, and we didn't need to worry about spying anymore. And it was all, the people who still talked about it were kind of dinosaurs from the past, and you need to forget about them. And I think there was a lot of that. Meanwhile, though, the Russian focus on the West remained persistent. They were patient. They were persistent. Yes, they had, went through some ups and downs. But fundamentally, they kept going and they kept their focus while we, I think, in the West, lost ours on Russia for many years and only recently have started to understand what was going on in Russia and how Russia had changed and the way they had kept focusing on us. So I think you're right that the spying continued, but there was this imbalance which came because of the 90s, and I think that was a mistake, and I think it's had consequences.
Yeah. From the introduction to the introduction of Gordon Correra's book, Russians Among Us here, and I'll just read it. This is a book about ghosts. The ghosts of spies past have haunted relations between Russia and the West even as the Cold War ended. The Cold War was fought through espionage and defined by it in the public mind, but when that conflict suddenly ended, the spying did not stop. Repeated cycles of treachery and the hunt for those responsible were an obsession for a small band of spies and spy catchers on both sides. Neither could let go. And this obsession mattered since the spy wars have continued to shape relations between the two sides over the decades, playing their role in the rise of Vladimir Putin and his drive for revenge. And that's a key word right there, that Vladimir Putin, as the leader of Russia, the remnant, if you will, of the Soviet Union, would be interested in strengthening his country, in defending his country. But the notion that a leader with that much power and that much in the way of weaponry at his hand would be that interested in revenge. I mean, we did not exactly kill the Soviet Union all by ourselves. It fell of its own weight. And does he really blame the West?
Well, that's what I found fascinating, is if you talk to Russians from that worldview, the worldview of the kind of KGB or Russian spies, and you read their speeches, what you learn is fascinating, because they don't want to believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of it economically couldn't keep up with the West. They don't want to believe it collapsed because of the problems to do with liberty or the lack of democracy. What they want to believe, and what they tell themselves, is it partly collapsed because of Western subversion, Western interference, that people like the CIA, Britain's MI6, were undermining the Soviet Union, the unity of the Soviet Union. They were stirring up troubles in some of the republics that made up the Soviet Union. That's the story that they've told themselves and that they've come to believe. And for that reason, they can blame its failure and collapse on outside forces. And it's an important story because they then see that this is something which has continued, and they really do believe this.
You go back three-quarters of a millennium, that sounds like the excuses that were being put forward as the Islamic Caliph was gradually deteriorating, again, through its own weight. But of course, it was all the fault of the Christian West. Well, I'm sorry, but it wasn't all the fault of the Christian West.
Yeah, but it wasn't. But it's really interesting that this view that there was Western subversion then informs the kind of Russian mindset, which is they've been doing it to us, we're going to do it to them. We have to fight back. We are besieged, and they tell this story and they believe it. And I think it is important we understand that, because even if we don't think it's true, we need to understand it, because it explains why they do some of the things they do and why they want to hunt for Western spies operating in Russia so much, and why they want to unleash their spies in the West to do certain things.
1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. This is Doc in Wilmington, Delaware. Good evening, Doc.
Fascinating show, Mr. Bohannon, as always, and thanks so much for taking my call. Mm-hmm. I will rush out to get this book as soon as I can.
For those who missed the name of it, it is Russians Among Us by Gordon Carrera. But go ahead, Doc.
Yes, Mr. Bohannon, thanks again. I'd like to ask your guest a loaded question. As always, the Britons are and his people, and he is a Briton, are at the forefront of scholarship in this area. To what extent currently are the Russians adept at infiltrating Western society at all levels, intelligence services, and military, academia, et cetera, our country, Britain, et cetera? Are they winning the war? Have they come back as an intelligence service? Where do we stand on, Mr. Carrera, in your estimation, sir?
That's a very good question, and one I've spent a lot of time trying to talk to people about. I think we have to be clear-eyed about what the Russian intelligence threat is, and it is certainly serious, but they're not everywhere. We have to get the balance right, because sometimes it's easy to say they're sloppy, or they're not that good. They can get things wrong, but it's easy to go the other way and say they're everywhere and they're all powerful. They're neither. What they often are very aggressive as an intelligence player, but also increasingly sometimes sloppy. They don't often care about getting caught. They're not as subtle as they used to be, but they're willing to take risks, I think, and do things which other countries are not. Their tolerance for risk is much higher.
And I'm guessing the Internet must help them an awful lot.
Exactly. So, and you've seen them willing and able to use new techniques faster than other countries and adapt to things like using cyber espionage, using the kind of stealing of information. You've seen them, in the UK, we saw them 2 years ago use a nerve agent, a chemical weapon, against a Russian who'd come to live in Salisbury, a quiet cathedral city in the UK, and they used nerve agent against them. Now people were absolutely shocked at that they were willing to go that far. So I think we do have to be clear about what they are willing to do. There's the traditional espionage. They are still trying to recruit agents to, find people they can subvert, steal secrets, but they're also willing to take risks and to try other things as well. So I do think we have to be clear-eyed about the threat. We don't want to exaggerate it too much. I think they're all powerful and everywhere either, but we do need to recognize that it's there.
Indeed. More to come. And full disclosure, by the way, in my past, I did serve in the U.S. Army Security Agency, which had sort of an adjunct relationship with the NSA, and for what it's worth. 1-866-50-JIMBO. Back in a moment. Yes, with lots of explosions and gunshots and beautiful women. Certainly that is part of, I suppose, the popular perception of spying. Movies like From Russia with Love, the second of the James Bond movies. Our guest deals with this in real life. Security correspondent for the BBC, Gordon Carrera, the author of a number of books, by the way, including The Art of Betrayal, The Secret History of MI6, and his latest, Russians Among Us, published by William Morrow, subtitled Sleeper Cells, Ghost Stories, and the Hunt for Putin's Spies. As we go to another call, your take on the popular conception of what's going on here.
Well, the popular conception is still defined, isn't it, by James Bond and John le Carré, and we still think of that as a lot about what spying is. And, the British Secret Service, MI6, is really funny about James Bond, because on the one hand, they are very keen to say, it's not like James Bond, we don't run around with guns and, we don't have a license to kill. But then they also kind of go, we did mention James Bond, didn't we? Because they really like the association with the kind of glamour of it as well. So they both kind of, try and distance themselves, but also associate themselves a little bit with the mystique that comes from James Bond and the fictional world.
Yeah.
So I always think it's fascinating how the kind of fact and fiction interplay, and how lots of, real-life spies reference themselves against, John le Carré novels and use some of the language from those novels as well.
Yeah. Let's talk to Michael in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Jim, and good evening, Gordon. Gordon, in 2013, the Russians invaded Crimea, and it became a full-fledged war by 2014. Now, in that same time frame, that was the fall, 2013, the fall of 2013. In that same time frame, Donald Trump accepted $10 million to hold the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow, and during that entire pageant, he sat next to the man who, the oligarch, the billionaire oligarch, who gave him that $10 million, and that oligarch's name was Aris Agalarov, and Agalarov is the man who got the Cozy Bear unit to steal the emails.
I'm not sure if there's something there to pursue. Our guest is certainly welcome to pursue it. But I doubt we can probably trace it back to Donald Trump's desire for the Russians to invade Crimea. But go ahead, Gordon.
Well, I mean, the people have looked at these kind of questions, and we've had the various inquiries. I'm not sure I've ever seen a link between those events in the Ukraine and, that visit by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I think clearly, there people have looked into what was going on, and there's still lots of kind of questions and mysteries, but the direct link between that, I'm not sure about myself.
Yeah, and in terms of a full-fledged war, if it were a full-fledged war, the Russians would have occupied all of Ukraine, including the capital of Kiev, in probably about 4 weeks.
What was really interesting is they used this new techniques of kind of hybrid warfare, of destabilizing a country, using information, using kind of covert action, using sometimes quite overt action, but denying that it was Russian and putting people into Crimea in uniform, and these so-called little green men who everyone knew were Russian, but they would deny the fact they were Russian. It was a really brazen operation, but kind of, people didn't almost know how to respond to that.
Yeah, and I have to wonder now, of course, although the U.S., Britain, Russia, and Ukraine did guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity upon the creation of that country, independent country, back in 91. But, of course, obviously we looked the other way when the situation came down to crunch time. However, let's say that the Russians decided they wanted the Baltic states back, Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania. Those are NATO members.
Exactly. And I think that would be different because, and one of the things you've seen is NATO put forces, what they call tripwire forces, up into to places like the Baltics and Eastern Europe, basically to say to the Russians, if you do move into these countries, you will encounter US, British forces, small numbers, not enough to stop you, but enough to mean you will be in direct contact and conflict with them, which means we're heading for war.
Exactly. So more to come here. We're coming up on a break that doesn't move. Gordon Carrera, Russians Among Us, back in a moment. From the Americans, they play a big part of this story, the British, the Russians. It's a big international game. The characters are familiar enough, but of course, then again, all of the individual parts may not be. For example, Chapter 8 of the book, Russians Among Us, and Gordon Carrera writes, it was the middle of the night, and the apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, was dark. Derek Piper was waiting nervously outside. His job was to be the lookout. The family who lived there in 2005 was on vacation, but he had to make sure no nosy neighbors turned up unexpectedly, while his colleagues turned over the place. What was going on inside, Gordon?
Well, it sounds like it was a burglary, but actually Derek and his colleagues were FBI agents, and the reason they were turning over the place was because they suspected, or really they knew, that apartment in New Jersey was being used by deep-cover Russian spies who were posing as Americans. So they were actually Russians who had turned themselves into an American couple and had two young daughters, Richard and Cynthia Murphy were the parents, and they were being watched by the FBI, and they were there searching for evidence to prove that they were indeed these Russian deep-cover spies who were known as illegals. That's the Russian terminology for these people who take on illegal because they don't have diplomatic cover or immunity, so they're not, if you like, in the Russian word, legal spies, but actually take on even a different nationality. and it's famous from the TV series The Americans, but these are the real spies on